in an earlier video, I went over the blood test data for a 100-year-old centenarian subject. Now, a valid criticism of that video was that her data may not have been representative of other centenarians. So I scoured the literature and looked for big studies in terms of sample sizes that have studied centenarians. So that's what I'm going to go over today. So in terms of how many centenarians data we're going to look at, so it's 275 centenarians, that's 100 to 104 years old, 387 semi-centenarians, that were 105 to 109 years old, and then 22 people, super-centenarians, who lived older than 110 years. But then also, as control groups, there were 536 community-dwelling older adults that were 85 to 99 years, and then 334 centenarian offspring and their spouses that were about 75 years. So a pretty nice age distribution for 75 to over 110-year-old subjects. In contrast, most studies are only studying up to about 80. So we're going to look at blood test data today past that limit. So let's have a look at the data. Blood test data for subjects 75 to 110 years old. So there's a lot of data here. Let's just unpack it very slowly. So first, in the left two columns, we've got data for the family of centenarians. In the left column are the offspring of centenarians, and as you can see, the distribution of men to women was more men than women. And then in the next column, unrelated family, these were the spouses of the offspring, and you can see it's exactly the opposite. So less men and more women. And the age groups of these two columns are in around the mid-70s. And then we've got very old subjects who are unrelated to the centenarians or their offspring, with an age range of 85 to 99 years and an average age of about 87. So then the centenarians. So the average centenarian, 100 to 104 years old, their average age there was about 101 years old. So the semi-centenarians, 105 to 109 years old, average age of about 107 years old in that group. And then the 110-year-old, the super-centenarians, only 22 subjects in the group, but with an average age of 111 years. So just before getting into the blood test data, I just want to highlight an important point here. So if you look at the age, the gender distribution of the centenarian groups, so when looking at the 100 to 104-year-old group, about 21 out of every 100 centenarians were men. So 8 out of 10 are women, and only about 2 out of 10 are men. So the probability of getting to 100 is far better if you're a woman than a man. So that probability gets worse as the age groups go up in age. So for the 105 to 109-year-old group, only 12 out of every 100 subjects were men, and 88 would be women. So far better odds of getting to the extreme ages if you're a woman, which again is verified by the super-centenarians, where only 9 out of every 100 super-centenarians were men, with 91 being women. So if you're a woman who's got longevity genes, congratulations. I don't. I'm going to have to science the out of aging to get there. And by studying blood test data and diet and all the ways that I do it, that's how I anticipate getting there if I can. So let's have a look at all of this blood test data. So first, some of this is going to be a review. I've published some of this data in other videos that I'll link in the right corner. So I'm kind of going to, I'd like to fly through some of this where I've already discussed it. For those of you who haven't seen it, welcome. All right, so white blood cells. So that's what I've got highlighted here. We can see that it's mostly in the 5,500 to 6,000 range for all of the age groups, with the exception of the super-centenarians, where we've got 6,300, around 6,300 white blood cells per microliter. So how does it change with age? And then what's optimal? All right, so first, in terms of the reference range, that isn't going to tell you what's optimal because it's right within the reference range. So perhaps the strongest data for white blood cells with aging comes from the Baltimore longitudinal study on aging, where subjects came in repeatedly up to about 40 years. So baseline visit, they kept coming in for up to 40 years. So the same subjects have data tracked for a long period of time relative to cross-sectional studies where you're just looking at groups, separate groups, which is important, but not as strong as longitudinal data. So what we can see is white blood cell counts in different amounts. So less than 3,500, 3,500 to 6,000, 6,001 to 10,000, and then greater than 10,000. So what's optimal? So we can look at average life expectancy at 50% survival, the time when half of the cohort has died or half is still alive. And what we can see is that, so for the 3,500 to 6,000 group, the average life expectancy when compared with baseline is about 38 years. So I've got that highlighted with the red lines on the x-axis. So in comparison, having higher than 6,000, 6,000 to 10,000, the average life expectancy was only 30 years. So an 8-year increase in lifespan, or life expectancy, sorry, for those who had 3,500 to 6,000. And even though those are both within the reference range, it's pretty clear that having 3,500 to 6,000 would be better for life expectancy. So in contrast, having more than 10,000, that's an error there, I should have fixed that, not less than. Having more than 10,000, the life expectancy was only 25 years. So 3,500 to 6,000 is optimal. And then when looking in the centenarian data, this is pretty good. They're right within that range with the exception of the super-centenarians who kind of get a little bit above it, but that's not too high. Now, I should mention that white blood cells are not all created equal. They're mostly comprised of neutrophils and lymphocytes, and I won't go into that data today, but neutrophils go up with age and lymphocytes go down, so that's going to be a topic for another video. So far, in terms of white blood cells, centenarians and their offspring and spouses of the offspring and the community dwellers, 85 to 99 years old, not doing too badly. All right, red blood cells and hemoglobin. Some of this data I've already gone over, but some of it I have not. So white blood cells first, you can see starting from the left side and going to the right, they decrease from about 4.44 and get into the less than 4, 3.62, 3.61, 3.77. So they decrease during aging there. Now, hemoglobin, which carries oxygen, is found within red blood cells. So if your red blood cells are decreasing during aging, so is your hemoglobin or your hemoglobin levels. And that's exactly what we see here from values of 13.8 and 13.3 in the 70-year-olds, 70-ish-year-olds, to in the low to mid 11s in the centenarians. So the reference range, for red blood cells, they'd be out of the reference range, and for hemoglobin, they'd also be out of the reference range, but that doesn't tell you much. So first, how do the red blood cells change with age? I've shown this in another video, and this just verifies the data for the centenarians, or the decrease with aging that we see from the centenarian offspring going towards centenarians. So red blood cells decrease from values of around 4.8 and 4.3 in men and women respectively, down to about 3.9 in 90-ish-year-olds, which, again, we see a similar trend in the centenarians. So what about mortality risk? So here's all-cause mortality risk, or risk of death for all causes, for levels of hemoglobin in the left for men and on the right for women. So when considering that most of the centenarian offspring were men, values around 13.8 aren't too bad. In terms of the values in the all-cause mortality plot for men, that'd be associated with an increased mortality risk, but it could be worse because if it was less than 13. Well, so for any of the centenarians that are men, they get to less than 13 with the values shown on the right in the 11s, they'd be at a higher all-cause mortality risk. In contrast, the women, for all-cause mortality risk to be elevated based on hemoglobin levels, they need to be less than 11. So in terms of the centenarian data that are in the 11s, it's close, it's borderline. So I should say that based on all of this, the red blood cell and hemoglobin data isn't great, but it's also not terrible. And in the way I see it, there's room for improvement. All right, platelets. So platelets here, they start off in the 70-year-olds, 70-ish-year-olds, 21.5 to 21.9, and I'm just going to use these in 100 units, so it would be platelets times 10 to the third per microliter, not times 10 to the fourth, so 215, 219 in the 70-ish-year-olds, and then in the centenarians, we see values around 189 to 193. So there's an age-related decrease, however slight it is. Now, the reference range doesn't tell you anything about that because it's within range. However, platelets decrease with aging, and that's what I've shown here by the red arrows in this plot. So this is a relatively big study of more than 500,000 subjects, and what we can see is based on, with the age groups from 20 to 90 to 100 years old, platelets decrease in the men from values around 230 to around 210, and then in women from around 260 to around 240. So we actually have a greater decrease here, right, because we get into the 190s, which isn't reflected by this age-related data. So it's a little worse than what's been published. Now, what about all-cause mortality risk? So we're looking at that data here in a study of 131 plus subjects. So platelet values, and I've got it highlighted with the arrow, that are in the 200 to 300 range are associated with lowest risk of death for all causes. And risk of death for all causes increases as you go below 200, and even worse, having less than 100, you can see the risk is 93% increase relative to the 8% increase for 100 to 200 platelets. And also for very high platelet levels, 300 to 400, there's also an increased risk of mortality. So for the platelets, this also isn't terrible. They're barely below 200, so not so bad. It could be far worse. It could have had less than 100 platelets based on the all-cause mortality data. All right, total cholesterol, and I've done a video on this too, so check it out if you're interested. So I'm just going to go through it real quick. So you can see the total cholesterol levels from the 7-year-olds and 88-year-old group. So values around 200 to 210 that then decrease into, from 172 to 165, 156 in the centenarians. And as I showed in that video, total cholesterol levels increase during aging and then decrease. So this data in the centenarians and their offspring and the other age groups just verifies that. And then in terms of mortality risk, at the younger ages, less than 100, they'd be close to optimal, as I've got highlighted here with the black lines. But then we can see the centenarian groups with the trend towards very or lower values, that they would be starting to increase their all-cause mortality risk based on their cholesterol data. What about HDL? So I haven't shown this data before. Let's have a look at it. So for HDL, there wasn't much of an age-related decrease until about 105 years old. So values in the 50s for the younger than 105-year-old age groups. But then you can see at the 105 to 110-year-old groups, 45 and 44 respectively. So fortunately, though, having lower cholesterol levels, or at least HDL cholesterol levels in these ranges, are not associated with dramatic increases in all-cause mortality risk. So this is data on HDL and risk of death from cardiovascular-related issues, so CV death, cancer death, and then other deaths. So there are 3 columns there. And then for the plot in men, so starting off in the 50s, what the younger age groups had HDL levels in the 50s. So for any men in the younger age groups that had HDL values in the 50s, reducing that to the 40s, there's no significant increase in risk of death for all causes. However, for the women having values in the 50s that drop to the 40s, there's an increase in risk for death from CV-related issues and other deaths. However, the increase is small. It's a small increase relative to having HDL levels in the 30s, which that's not what the average values here were in the older, the semi and the super-centenarian groups. So HDL, not bad. All right, albumin. And I'd argue that albumin may be the most underrated biomarker that exists. I mean, most people think about glucose and inflammation. There are several biological age calculators that seem to always come up with albumin as one of their most important biological age predictors. So I've shown this in another video, and let's have a look at their data. So albumin levels from the younger age groups, values around 4.2, that decrease all the way up to the the super-centenarians to values around 3.2. Now, in terms of the reference range, so they barely get out of the reference range. And how does it change during aging? So we can see that albumin levels decrease with age. That's what I've shown here in a study of more than 1 million subjects. And if we would look at where the data starts for the youngest age group, the people in the 70s, and then the centenarians and beyond, we can see that they're just on the age-related decrease, the decrease for albumin with age, that there isn't anything special going on here other than following the trend like this study of 1 million subjects. And then in terms of all-cause mortality risk, having higher levels of albumin are associated with lower all-cause mortality risk. So for men, having values greater than 4.5, and then in women, values greater than 4.4 are associated with lowest risk of death for all causes. So anything lower than those values is associated with higher mortality risk, regardless of age, at younger ages and at older ages. And you can see that data here for both the men and the women. So their albumin level isn't great. Now, what's important is that albumin levels, from my experience, are malleable. You can alter it with diet. So I'd like to see some studies in very old subjects, semi and super-centenarians, that try to alter their diet with the goal of improving their albumin levels. All right, kidney function. So let's have a look at that. And one way to look at that is by looking at their creatinine levels, and that's what we see here. So based on our creatinine levels, even though there is a small increase and then decrease throughout the groups during aging, because creatinine levels increase during aging, we'd expect to see very high levels of creatinine in the oldest old, but that's not what we see here. So, and if you just look at the reference range, they're pretty much within range. There's nothing to be worried about. All-cause mortality data, a similar story. We can see that the lowest risk of death for all causes has been reported in the 0.6 to 1.1 milligram per deciliter range for creatinine, and they'd be just around the lowest risk there. Now, there may be something going on here, though, and what I mean by that is creatinine levels are correlated with muscle mass. Now, whereas creatinine levels increase on their own, independent of muscle mass, when you have a decrease in muscle mass, you're going to have a decrease in creatinine. So you've got the age-related creatinine increase is related to decreased kidney function, but then you've also got a decrease in muscle mass, and creatinine is stored within muscle, or a large portion of it is stored within muscle. So you have an age-related increase because of decreased kidney function, but then you have decreased muscle mass, which would decrease creatinine levels. So the effect may be washed out here in terms of one thing's going up and one thing's going down, so you really don't see any change in it. So I'd argue other measures of kidney function should probably be investigated in each of these subjects to further get at what's going on with kidney function. All right, and then inflammation, and I shouldn't have to emphasize this too much, but everybody pretty much knows inflammation goes up with age, and it's bad for health. Let's just take a relatively quick look at the data here, though. So they looked at C-reactive protein, CRP, interleukin-6, IL-6, and TNF-alpha, and what you can see for each of these inflammatory markers is they all increased during aging, from the 70-year-olds to the super-centenarians, 111 years old. So I've gone over CRP in another video. I'll link to that in the right corner. Let's have a look at the other data, IL-6 and TNF-alpha. So first, in a meta-analysis of 9 IL-6 studies, this just shows that having higher IL-6, and I've rectangled that on the bottom. So there's a 49% increase with having in all-cause mortality risk with higher IL-6 values compared to lower values. So just verifying that having higher IL-6 during aging is not good. Now, in contrast, the data for TNF-alpha is a little bit more variable than the CRP and IL-6 data. So first, in age-related increases for CRP and IL-6, but not TNF-alpha, were found in the first study. And then higher IL-6 and CRP were associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk in the next study, but not TNF-alpha. So the first two inflammatory markers increases all-cause mortality risk in the second study, but no association for TNF-alpha with mortality risk in that study. And then there is data that shows an increased all-cause mortality risk for TNF-alpha, but that was shown only in men, but not women in the last study here. So CRP and IL-6, I'd argue, more established markers of age-related inflammation than TNF-alpha. And then last but not least, Cytomegalovirus. So it's a virus, and if you look at the data here, it's up in every group. And not just up, if you look at the percentage here in each group, so starting in the 7-year-olds, so 97.6% of the first group, 99.4%, 98.1%, 99.6%, and then the semi and super-centenarians all had CMV infection, either active or previous. Now, there's so much emphasis on coronavirus, and there should be, because it's instantaneous. You can be dead in a month, whereas CMV can sit latent for decades. But CMV deserves its own video. But just briefly introduce CMV to everybody. I should say it's one of the herpes viruses. It's HHV5, so that's cytomegalovirus. It increases during aging. That's what I've shown here. So starting off in kids, 6 to 11 years old, the prevalence of them being infected with CMV, 36%. And then if you go down each age group, you can see that in adults older than 80, in this study, around 91% had been infected or were currently affected with CMV. So this data here in the older than 80 age groups, we can see it's even more than 90%. It's if you live long enough, we're all going to get it. And then as an interesting brief story, it ties in potentially to the NAD story. So in this study here, they found that infecting endothelial cells, in this case human umbilical vein endothelial cells, HUVEC cells, infecting those cells with CMV resulted in significantly decreased SIRT1 protein levels. So SIRT1 is a anti-aging protein, so having less of it would be bad for aging. And I'm probably going to talk more about CMV, SIRT1, and the other effects of CMV on aging in another video, so stay tuned for that. All right, if you made it to the end, thanks a lot, and that's all I've got. You can find me lots of places online. Have a great day.